Scientists agree the first humans evolved in Africa. But today, there are people living at the very tip of South America, thousands of miles away, across oceans and mountains and deserts. So how did they get there? For years, the answer was simple. People walked across a frozen strip of land from Asia into Alaska. Case closed. But in 2021, that answer broke completely. Scientists in New Mexico found footprints pressed into ancient mud, footprints left by teenagers walking along a lake, thousands of years before humans were even supposed to be in America. So if humans were already here that early, how did they actually get here? To understand that, we need to go back much further and take this one step at a time. Around 26,000 years ago, Earth entered the coldest point of the last ice age. Glaciers grew so massive that they locked up huge amounts of the planet's water, and sea levels around the world dropped by more than 300 feet. Where the narrow Bering Strait sits today, between Russia and Alaska, the falling sea exposed dry land. Not a thin bridge, but a vast stretch of ground, in places nearly 1,000 miles wide. Scientists call this land Beringia. Grass grew there. Mammoths grazed there. And small groups of humans, following those animals for food, slowly moved onto it from Asia, with no idea they were stepping onto the edge of a new continent. Here's where it gets interesting. Genetic evidence tells us these people didn't just walk straight through. They got stuck. For thousands of years, roughly between 25,000 and 15,000 years ago, this population lived in Beringia, cut off from both Asia behind them and the Americas ahead of them, boxed in by ice on almost every side. Scientists call this the Beringian Standstill. It's like a waiting room that lasted 10,000 years. So what were they waiting for? To the east, covering nearly all of what's now Canada, sat two massive ice sheets, fused together into one solid, unbroken wall. There was no path through the middle of the continent. Not yet. The old theory said that once the climate started warming, around 14,000 years ago, a narrow corridor finally cracked open between those ice sheets, and people rushed south through that gap to become the first Americans. For decades, this was the accepted story. But remember those footprints from New Mexico? This is where the timeline stops making sense. Those footprints date to between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. That's before the standstill even ended. That's thousands of years before the ice sheets pulled apart. If the only way south was through a corridor that didn't open until 14,000 years ago, people simply could not have been standing in New Mexico 8,000 years earlier. Something about the old story has to be wrong. This is where scientists started looking somewhere else entirely, not through the middle of the continent, but along its edge. Picture the Pacific coastline of that same Ice Age world, from Siberia down through Alaska and along the west coast of North America. Even while the interior was choked with ice, patches of this coastline were ice-free and shockingly rich with food, kelp forests packed with fish, shellfish, and seals. Researchers now call this the Kelp Highway. Using simple boats and moving along exposed beaches and inlets, people could have traveled south hugging the coast, without ever needing that inland corridor to open at all. Studies suggest this coastal route was fully clear and usable by around 16,000 years ago. That solves part of the puzzle, explaining how people could have reached South America by 14,000 years ago, around the time of Monte Verde, a famous site in Chile with wooden structures and tools that predate the old Clovis First theory. Clovis First was the long-standing idea that the earliest Americans were a single group identified by a distinct style of stone spear point, first found near Clovis, New Mexico, and that no one arrived before them. Monte Verde's older dates were some of the first solid evidence that this wasn't the whole story. But it still leaves a gap. If the coast wasn't fully open until 16,000 years ago, how were there already footprints in New Mexico 7,000 years before that? This is the honest answer. Nobody knows for certain yet. It's possible small groups found narrower, ice-free pockets along the coast even earlier than 16,000 years ago. It's possible there's an entirely different route we haven't found evidence of. This isn't a gap in my research. It's a real, unresolved gap in the science itself, one that professional archaeologists are actively arguing about right now. And there's a frustrating reason we may never find a clean answer. Remember those dropped sea levels during the Ice Age? As the glaciers melted, the ocean rose again by over 300 feet. Any coastal campsites, tools, or shelters those early travelers left behind are now sitting underwater, buried under sediment, miles off today's coastline. The strongest evidence for the coastal route may be permanently out of reach, sitting on the seafloor. So here's where that leaves us. Humans didn't arrive in the Americas in one clean wave, walking through one gap in the ice. The real picture is messier. Groups moved south in overlapping pulses, some possibly hugging the coast in boats far earlier than we can currently prove, others moving through the interior once the ice sheets finally split apart thousands of years later. And this story is still being rewritten in real time. Every few years, another site turns updates that don't fit the accepted timeline, forcing scientists to choose between defending the old model or following the evidence somewhere new. The first chapter of the human story in the Americas is still being written, and so far, every new discovery says the same thing. We got there earlier, and by more paths, than anyone thought possible. And if you want to be the person in the room who actually knows this stuff, hit subscribe.